Welcome to the Darkling Radio, where every story drags you into the shadows. True fear, chilling mysteries, and haunting tales told in a way that makes you feel like you're living them. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and dare to listen. When Evelyn Clark unlocked the door to her family's old house, she expected peeling paint and forgotten rooms. Instead, she found a photograph where her image had been erased. Footprints that appeared while she slept, and something waiting in the shadows to whisper, "Welcome home." I stepped onto the front porch with a heaviness I couldn't explain, as though the house itself had been waiting for me all these years. 10 years had passed since I last stood here, and yet nothing had changed. The faded white paints peeled like dry skin. The shutters leaned awkwardly as if they might fall with the next strong breeze. And the door stood slightly ajar, just the way it always had in my memory. I paused, staring at that gap, a sliver of darkness that seemed to breathe on its own, exhaling a damp, cold air that brushed against my face. My chest tightened as though invisible fingers had curled around it, and for a moment I considered turning back. But something stronger pulled me forward, a need to step inside and reclaim a place that was supposed to be mine. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I crossed the threshold, a long drawn-out creak that echoed into the emptiness. Dust particles floated in the weak shafts of light that cut through the grime-caked windows, swirling lazily in the air as if disturbed by my intrusion. Each corner of the house seemed darker than it should have been, shadows pooling unnaturally, stretching and clinging to the walls as if alive. I felt the strange mixture of recognition and alienation, the way you do when remembering a dream you half believed was real. The wallpaper still peeled in the same places. The faint smell of damp would lingered, and yet there was something wrong, something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just emptiness that filled these rooms. It was a kind of waiting, a silent patience that made the hairs on my neck rise. I wandered slowly through the hallway, each step producing an echo that sounded slightly delayed, as though footsteps followed just behind me. I told myself it was only the acoustics of an old house, but the thought of being shadowed clung to me. Then I noticed something I didn't remember ever being there. Hanging crooked on the hallway wall was a photograph. My stomach clenched as I stepped closer. It was my family, my parents, my younger sister, even the dog that had died before I left. They were smiling, frozen in happiness that seemed staged, stiff, unnatural. But what unsettled me most was not their expressions. It was that I wasn't in the picture. The longer I stared, the colder I felt. My absence was not like a mistake or a forgotten detail. It felt deliberate, as though I had been erased. There was even a space where I should have stood, a gap between my sister and my father, the space of a body that was missing. My skin prickled, and I stepped back, but something caught my eye near the bottom of the frame. Scratched faintly into the wooden border were words, messy and jagged, as though carved with a knife. The letters were uneven, gouged deep enough to flake splinters, and when I leaned closer to read them, the breath froze in my lungs. "Welcome home." The words felt less like a greeting and more like a warning, an acknowledgement that my return had been expected. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I tore my eyes away from the frame. But the message clung to me, whispering in my mind. I forced myself to move, to keep walking through the hallway and into the next room. Yet the sense of wrongness deepened with every step. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing closer as if the house itself were folding in around me. I ended up in the living room, though it looked nothing like I remembered. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, shapes of forgotten memories buried beneath them. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like thin, delicate traps. The fireplace was cold, filled with blackened ash, but what struck me most was the mirror above the mantel. Its surface was clouded with dust, but when I wiped it with my sleeve, I saw more than just my reflection. Behind me, faintly, in the mirror's haze, stood the outline of another figure. Taller, thinner, too blurred to make out details, but unmistakably there. I spun around quickly, heart hammering, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the glass, the shape was gone. I stood there frozen, my hands trembling, my skin clammy, unable to move for what felt like an eternity. The silence pressed in heavier than before, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint ticking of the old clock somewhere down the hall. My throat was dry, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks after years away from this place. Still, the unease stayed with me as I made my way back toward the hallway. My eyes drifted unwillingly to the photograph again, to the smiling faces that seemed to stare directly at me now. The carved words glared at me from the frame, deeper, sharper, almost fresh, as if they hadn't been there just moments ago. The letters seemed to whisper inside my skull, "Welcome home." And this time, I could swear I felt the house itself exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for my return. I tried to convince myself that the first night back in my old house would be nothing more than a restless one, the kind anyone might have after returning to a place filled with too many memories. But as I climbed the creaking staircase and pushed open the door to my childhood bedroom, I felt a chill seep into me that I couldn't shake. The room was exactly as I remembered, the faded wallpaper with tiny patterns of stars, the cracked wooden dresser pushed against the far wall, and the bed that seemed smaller now, though it had once been my whole world, yet the air was heavy, dense with dust and silence, and I could not stop myself from imagining the years this room had sat waiting, untouched, while I was gone. I forced myself into bed, the sheets stiff and smelling faintly of mildew. The ceiling above seemed to sag lower than I remembered, as though it were leaning down to listen. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and every shadow in the corners appeared alive, twitching in the edges of my vision. The old clock in the hallway ticked faintly, each second stretched too long until I could swear the rhythm was no longer ticking but pulsing like a heartbeat echoing through the house. Sleep would not come. My body lay still, but my mind refused to settle, twitching with every sound. At first it was only the shifting of wood, the natural groan of an old house cooling in the night, but then came something sharper, something distinct. Above me, faint but deliberate, I heard it the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, circling across the attic floor. The attic had always been locked, always sealed. No one could be up there. Yet the sound continued, heel followed by toe, pausing, then resuming, the pacing of someone who knew I was lying awake beneath them. I buried myself deeper into the covers, holding my breath, but the weight of dread pressed heavier on my chest. It was not just footsteps anymore. I could almost feel the boards above me strain with each step, as if something was growing heavier with every turn. My skin prickled, and the thought of moving, of getting up and leaving the room was impossible. I stayed still, paralyzed, counting each step in my head until the rhythm became unbearable. Then, suddenly, silence. For a moment I thought it was over, but then the mattress shifted beneath me. The dip was slight at first, like the edge of the bed sinking under a light weight. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst. Slowly, the pressure grew stronger, as though something invisible had sat down beside me. I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified of what I might see if I opened them. The air grew colder, and the sharp scent of damp earth filled my nostrils. I could feel it close, the presence of something that did not belong to this world. The weight pressed down harder, almost crushing, then eased, then returned again, like a body adjusting itself into place. I lay there frozen, too afraid to even tremble, and counted my breaths in my head. Eventually I forced myself to look, telling myself there would be nothing there, that it was only exhaustion and nerves playing cruel tricks. The bed was empty. No shape, no figure, nothing but the worn blankets twisted around my legs. My relief was short-lived because my eyes drifted downward and caught the carpet at the foot of the bed. It was wet. Dark patches spread across the floor, glistening faintly in the thin moonlight that leaked through the window. The dampness trailed in a line. Clear footprints pressed into the fibers, leading away from the bed. The tracks stopped at the closet door. My chest tightened, my mouth dry as I realized the door, which I was certain I had shut before lying down, now stood slightly open. The gap was wide enough to reveal only blackness inside, darker than the rest of the room, too dark to be natural. The footprints ended at that shadow, disappearing into it as though swallowed whole. I lay motionless, my eyes locked on that sliver of darkness, my body trembling with each beat of my heart. The house was silent again, but the silence was worse than any sound. It was waiting, pressing against me, daring me to move, daring me to look closer. The closet door moved then, only slightly, as though something inside had leaned forward, pushing gently against it from within. The darkness seemed to pulse outward, spreading across the floor, swallowing the edges of the room. I pulled the covers over my face, desperate to block it out, but even in the darkness beneath the fabric I could feel it. A gaze that pierced through walls, through flesh, straight into my thoughts. The weight of it settled into me as surely as the footsteps above had, a silent promise that whatever had entered my room was not finished. When I finally dared to lower the covers, the closet door stood wide open, the darkness yawning like a mouth. The footprints were gone, but I knew, with a certainty that hollowed out my chest, that something was still in there, and it was waiting for me to fall asleep. The smell was the first thing that pulled me from what little rest I had managed to find. It was sharp and sour, cutting through the heavy air of the house, clinging to my throat in a way that made me want to gag. It was faint at first, almost easy to dismiss, but by morning it had grown stronger, seeping into every corner of the upstairs hallway. I tried to ignore it as I moved through the rooms, convincing myself it was just mildew or rot from the years of neglect. Yet no matter where I went, the stench followed, thickening until it felt like the house itself was exhaling decay. The trail of it drew me to the basement door. I hadn't been down there in years, not since I was a child who hated the suffocating dark and the way the silence pressed against your ears like cotton. My hand hovered over the rusted doorknob longer than I'd like to admit. I told myself there was nothing waiting on the other side, that the smell was just mold, that the house was only old wood and dust. But my hand moved anyway, and with a reluctant push, the door groaned open. The stairs stretched downward, narrow and steep, as though they wanted to swallow me whole. A thin light flickered weakly from the single bulb above, swaying slightly, though there was no draft to move it. I descended one step at a time, the boards creaking under my weight, each sound magnified in the thick silence. The air grew colder, heavier, and with every breath the stench grew worse, burning my nostrils and clinging to my tongue. At the bottom I paused, gripping the railing until my knuckles ached. The basement looked smaller than I remembered, yet the shadows filled it greedily, stretching over the walls and pooling in corners. Old boxes slumped against one another, blankets and broken furniture piled in heaps, and in the far corner, half hidden beneath a mound of dusty fabric, something caught my eye. The shape was too deliberate, too unnatural to be junk. My legs felt heavy, but they moved forward anyway, as though the house itself pushed me closer. The smell grew unbearable as I reached the pile. I pinched the edge of one of the blankets with shaking fingers and pulled it back. What I uncovered stopped my breath cold. It wasn't what I expected it. Wasn't an animal or a corpse rotting in the shadows. It was a mirror, but it was not like any mirror I had ever seen. The glass shimmered faintly, dark and heavy, like liquid caught in a frame. I leaned closer and my stomach turned to ice. The basement reflected perfectly the boxes, the stairs, the dangling light bulb, but my own reflection was gone. In my place stood something else. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head brushing against the ceiling. Its skin was pale, stretched too tightly across sharp bones, and its mouth curved upward in a grin that was wide and endless. The eyes were hollow pits, darker than the shadows around it, yet I felt them drilling into me with unbearable intensity. The longer I stared, the more I realized the thing was not only inside the mirror, it was closer than that. Its presence pressed against me like a second skin, as if the glass were not a boundary but a window, a thin veil between my world and its bait. The light bulb above me flickered violently, casting the basement into stuttering darkness. Each time the light returned, the figure in the mirror moved closer. First it was standing across the room, then it was directly behind me. Then, for a flicker so brief I thought I might have imagined it, I saw its grin stretching over my own shoulder. I spun around, heart slamming in my chest, but there was nothing, only boxes, only shadows. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was once again at a distance, as though mocking me. Its hand rose slowly, pale fingers curling upward, and it pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like disturbed water, shuddering outward in waves. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The air in the basement was suffocating now, thick with the smell of earth and rot. The mirror seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that wasn't mine, as though the thing inside it was alive, waiting, patient. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me, pressing my back against the wood as though it could keep whatever I'd seen trapped below. My pulse pounded in my ears, my entire body trembling. But even as I stood there, gasping in the dim hallway light, I felt it, that same gaze, burning through the walls, crawling up through the floorboards, watching me still. And when I dared to glance down at my hands, I saw faint streaks of dust smeared across my skin. The same kind of dust that had clung to the surface of the mirror. It was proof that I hadn't just imagined it. Proof that, for one terrifying moment, something on the other side had reached for me. The house no longer felt like a place I could call my own. Every corner seemed alive. Every wall seemed to hum with something I could not see but could feel pressing against me. The air carried a heaviness that was different from the damp and dust of neglect. It was a presence, thick and suffocating, like someone else was always in the room no matter where I went. I tried to avoid thinking about the mirror in the basement, but the memory of its warped reflection clung to me like a stain. Even when I shut the door tight, I could still sense it below, waiting patiently. Its smile burned into the edges of my mind. That night, I refused to go back upstairs. My bedroom felt poisoned by the open closet, and the thought of lying in that bed again made my skin crawl. I stayed in the kitchen instead, trying to distract myself with the faint comfort of routine. I sat at the old table, tapping my fingers against the wood, trying to steady my thoughts. But when I finally looked up, my stomach twisted violently. On the table, neatly placed as though set for dinner, was a plate of food. Steam curled upward in slow spirals, carrying the scent of something freshly cooked meat and vegetables, warm bread, even the faint hint of herbs. My skin prickled. I hadn't cooked anything. I hadn't even bought groceries. The refrigerator was empty, the cabinets bare. Yet here it was, a meal prepared as though someone knew I would be hungry. Beside the plate was a fork, positioned perfectly, handle angled toward where I sat. The chair across from me had been pulled out slightly, just enough to suggest someone had been sitting there only moments before, or was about to. I stared at it, unable to breathe, my body locked in place. The food was so out of place in the decay of the house, too warm, too fresh, too real. I could almost convince myself it was safe if not for the silence pressing around me, a silence that felt like it was holding its breath. Then I heard it. The sound was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. Chewing, slow, wet chewing, as though someone was savoring each bite of a meal. The sound didn't come from the plate in front of me, it came from the empty space beside it. My eyes darted toward the chair, and though it remained empty, the air above it shimmered faintly, as though heat distorted it. The chewing grew louder, accompanied by the soft clink of a fork against porcelain, though the silverware never moved. I stumbled backward, my chair screeching against the floor. The sound stopped instantly. the silence falling heavier than before. My chest heaved, my breath ragged, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the table. The food still steamed, curling upward in mocking tendrils. A faint drip of something dark slid down the side of the plate, too thick to be gravy, too red to be anything but blood. It pooled slowly on the table, spreading outward in a thin, gleaming stain. I backed into the counter, gripping the edge until my fingers ached. I wanted to run, to leave the kitchen, to flee the house entirely, but my legs refused to obey. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken, until the faint scrape of wood against wood pierced it. The chair moved. Not much, only an inch or two, but enough to make the table shudder. Enough to prove it wasn't empty. The smell of the food shifted then, no longer warm and savory. It curdled into something sour, metallic, the stench of rot beneath fresh paint. My stomach twisted violently, bile burning the back of my throat. I forced myself to look away, but in the corner of my eye I saw the steam thicken, darken, until it no longer looked like steam at all but smoke rising from something charred. The chewing began again, louder this time, impossibly close. It came not from the chair anymore but from just behind me, inches from my ear. The sound was wet and deliberate, each bite followed by a slow swallow. My entire body seized, every muscle trembling, yet I didn't dare move. The smell of rotting meat enveloped me, as though invisible jaws had opened wide beside my head. I forced myself to turn, to face whatever was there, but the kitchen was empty. Nothing but shadows pressed against the corners. Nothing but the faint hiss of the old refrigerator filling the air. Yet when I turned back to the table, the plate was empty. The food was gone. Only the smear of red remained, spreading slowly across the wood, dripping onto the floor. I staggered out of the kitchen, my breath shallow, my vision blurring with panic. But even as I escaped into the hallway, I heard the faint scrape of the fork against porcelain. It was still there, still eating, as though the meal was endless, as though I had never left the table at all. By the fifth day I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. My face was pale, hollow-eyed, my skin clammy from sleepless nights spent listening to the house breathe around me. Every hour stretched longer than the one before it, every minute filled with the weight of watching shadows and waiting for the next sound to rise from the walls. I could not shake the feeling that I had been lured here, that the house had never been empty at all. Something else lived here, something that had been waiting, patient, until I returned. The photograph in the hallway haunted me most of all, the one where my family smiled without me. I had passed it dozens of times over the past days, always quickening my steps, always forcing my eyes forward. But that morning I stopped. My hands trembled as I reached up, tugging it from the wall. The frame scraped against the wallpaper, dust scattering across my fingers. I turned it over, hoping for some explanation, some note or forgotten memory that could make sense of it. Instead, I found another photograph hidden behind it. This one showed the same scene, my family standing in front of the house, smiling, but now I was there. At first I thought it was a relief, that I had been mistaken. But as my eyes adjusted, I felt a weight sink into my chest. My figure in the photo was not right. My body was there, but my face had been smeared into nothing, a blur of skin and shadow, as though the image itself rejected me. The others smiled, frozen in their staged joy. But the blurred face where mine should have been seemed to twitch, if I looked too long, as though it wanted to form into something else. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking so violently that the frame splintered on the floor. My breath came shallow, ragged, and when I looked up, the hallway around me seemed darker than before. The shadows stretched longer, as though the walls had shifted closer. I stumbled back, clutching the wall for support, but the air grew colder with every step. It was then I noticed the silence. For days, the house had never been truly still. There had always been footsteps, whispers, the creak of doors shifting when no one touched them. Now there was nothing. No tick of the clock, no groan of the wood. Just a silence so deep it made my ears ring. I felt it press against me, thick and heavy, smothering. And in that silence, I knew I was not alone. From the far end of the hallway, a shadow began to move. It stretched upward, taller and taller, until it scraped the ceiling. Its shape was not human, not entirely, but twisted, elongated, the bones of a figure distorted beyond reason. Pale skin gleamed faintly in the dark, and a mouth stretched into the same grin I had seen in the basement mirror. My body froze, every muscle locking in place, but my mind screamed for me to run. The figure did not move toward me. It did not need to. The shadows around it writhed, creeping along the walls, reaching out like hands stretching for me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back into the living room, my shoulders slamming into the doorway. The mirror above the fireplace caught my eye, and for the briefest moment, I saw not one figure, but many. Dozens of pale faces grinned back at me from the glass, pressed together, their hollow eyes locked on me. I tried to run, but the floor shifted beneath my feet, the boards groaning like a voice. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though I was sinking into the wood itself. My vision blurred with panic, and when I reached the front door I found it closed, locked tight, though I had left it ajar when I first entered. My fingers clawed at the handle, but it would not turn, no matter how violently I shook it. Behind me, I heard it, Not footsteps this time, not whispers, but a voice. It was inside my head, low and steady, vibrating in my skull. Welcome home. The words echoed again and again, until they drowned out my own thoughts, until they filled every part of me. My knees buckled, and I sank against the door, my chest heaving. The shadows pressed closer, curling around my arms, my legs, dragging me backward toward the darkness that filled the hallway. I tried to fight, clawing at the wood of the door until my nails split and bled, but the house had claimed me. I felt it in every breath of damp air, in every vibration of the floor beneath me. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the photograph lying broken on the floor. My face was no longer blurred. It was clear now, sharp, smiling with the same hollow grin as the figure that stood waiting in the shadows. And then the house exhaled, long and deep, as if it had finally taken back what it was owed.